BL Story of Love welcomes you. If you're here for the first time, do one simple thing right now. Hit like, subscribe, and listen to this story to the very end. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and imagine this. Your body has a price, your life does not. Noah had been living in a kind of budget mode for so long that it could no longer be called simple caution. It was survival mode. His rented room above a small cafe looked more like a storage closet where someone had accidentally shoved a narrow bed and a cheap wardrobe. The walls smelled of old grease and coffee, and the floor shook every time the extractor fan roared to life downstairs. The window never closed all the way. In winter, a thin line of cold crept in along the frame. In summer, that same gap let in street noise and fumes. For Noah, this had become normal. The alternative was much worse. A place in an intake shelter for omegas with unstable hormones. The cafe job barely kept him afloat, and only in the most literal sense. From morning to late night he ran between tables, carried heavy trays, smiled at customers, and listened to other people talk about deals, vacations, and new cars. By the end of each shift his hands ached, his back throbbed, and in his pocket there was just enough money to pay rent, buy the cheapest food, and most importantly, pay for the pills that kept his hormone levels from crashing into a dangerous storm. Pregnancy crept up on him the way a mild cold does at first. You ignore it, thinking it will pass. The fatigue seemed ordinary at the beginning. Then, the morning nausea became too insistent. At first, Noah blamed stress, overtime, bad sleep. But when his body started reacting to the smell of fried meat like it was poison, when his own skin suddenly felt heavy and foreign, he understood. This was not just a bad week. The test he bought at an all-night pharmacy with his last few bills showed two clear lines. The pulling pain under his ribs as he sat on the edge of the bathtub was not really physical. It was financial. In his head, a spreadsheet built itself in seconds. Rent, food, medication, doctor's visits, labor. The numbers added up to one simple verdict. He was barely making it on his own as it was. There was no way he could support two lives. The alpha who had started all this was one of those people you call a random hookup. A nightclub, the smell of expensive cologne, a brief, almost feral flash of chemistry, where, for a couple of hours, Noah allowed himself to forget who he was and how little his body was worth on the labor market. The alpha's name dissolved into the music. His number never made it into Noah's phone, and in the morning, instead of a proper goodbye, there was only one cold phrase Noah still heard in his memory. "I don't get involved with omegas." The door had slammed. That was the end of that story. Only his body did not forget. Now that body had become the center of the problem. Any doctor, any clinic, any tests, everything cost money. An abortion too. Every option except maybe it will sort itself out had a price tag that, for him, was the same as impossible. Noah racked his brain, scrolled through ads, tried to take on extra shifts, but his body gave out faster than he could catch new side jobs. He did not find the surrogacy agency through an ad, but in a registry of charity programs he stumbled on while desperately looking for any support for pregnant omegas without partners. Between familiar logos of shelters and clinics, a neat website flashed by with a cold, neutral name and carefully chosen wording. There were no words like despair or hopelessness. Instead, there were words about compensation, insurance, medical care, and the chance to help those who dream of a child. He stared at that page for a long time in a cheap internet cafe where the computer smelled like plastic and other people's hands. His fingers would not press the submit application button. Inside his head, two voices argued. One said, "This is the last line. Next is selling organs." The other answered, "Either you sell 9 months or the two of you end up on the street." He sent the application late at night when exhaustion dulled his fear. A short form, a few honest lines about his health, the term of the pregnancy, the lack of support. He did not expect a quick reply, but the agency turned out to be more efficient than any social service. After only 2 days, a message came to his old, cracked phone, inviting him in for a consultation. The agency office was in a building he had never set foot in before. Glass, metal, soft chairs in the lobby, no smell of cafeteria food or cheap coffee, only the scent of filtered air and a neutral, expensive air freshener. The manager, who introduced herself as Miss Pack, looked perfectly composed, smooth hair, neat suit, even voice. She talked about the process like logistics for a large shipment. Clearly, without extra emotion, the phrase "already pregnant" did not bother her at all. On the contrary, it was a plus on her checklist. The Omega's body had already proven it could carry to term. Their lawyers, she explained, could arrange everything so that the child legally belonged to the future father, one of the Alpha partners, through recognition of paternity and official testing. There was no trace of moral judgment in her voice, only cold steel professionalism. The conversation about money was a separate block. The amount she named near the end of the meeting sounded like a foreign language to Noah. It was more than he could earn in several years: compensation for carrying the child, a separate package for medical expenses, a bonus for special circumstances. His temples buzzed. This number meant not just rent and food. It meant the chance to finally leave this neighborhood, change jobs, and actually recover after giving birth. Inside, though, everything shrank with disgust at himself. Selling his body stopped being a metaphor. What he was about to do turned his pregnancy into a service, not a gift, not a tragedy, a line in a contract. Noah sat across from flawless Miss Pack and could only think about one thing. Would he be able to look at himself in the mirror after agreeing to this? He heard about the future parents from the file they showed him at the end. Aiden and Marcus, two alphas whose last names sometimes appeared in the news. One owned a chain of hotels and was used to building luxury out of glass and concrete. The other was an architect who also ran charity projects and loved to talk about accessible spaces. The photos on the screen showed a handsome, well-groomed couple hugging at yet another charity gala. The perfect magazine picture. No one there cared who stood on the other side of the camera. The first in-person meeting took place in a private clinic. Noah got there by metro and bus, feeling like an alien particle in the stream of expensive cars at the entrance. The corridors smelled of antiseptic and fresh linen. Soft lighting hid the tired lines on patients' faces. Aiden and Marcus walked in right on time, in perfectly tailored suits, carrying the polished confidence of people who are used to getting exactly what they pay for. They were polite, not warm, not cold, exactly polite. They asked how he felt, asked about his response to hormone treatments, asked about his work schedule. Their questions sounded like they were discussing a new project, important, but not the only one in their lives. At some point, Marcus, looking toward the monitor with Noah's test results, said quietly that the child would have the best of everything. Noah was not sure if that best included him. The contract they put on the table seemed thicker than any book he had ever held. The pages smelled of fresh ink and money. The agency lawyer marked the main points with colored tabs: medical support, diet, limits on work, a confidentiality clause, and that one crucial section where the surrogate agreed to give up any and all rights to the child after birth. The payment amount was written there too, along with the schedule of transfers and a neat little line explaining that, in case of breach, the contract could be reviewed. The words, "gives up any and all rights," cut deeper than anything else. Legally, they were necessary. Humanly, they were brutal. Noah caught himself automatically laying his palm on his still almost flat stomach, only slightly heavier than a few weeks before. The thought that a life was already forming inside him did not fit into that one cold line of legal text. But the thought that without that line, he might not even make it to delivery fit all too well. "This is not your child," he repeated to himself while reading, skipping over the unfamiliar legal phrases. "This is a contract. This is a job. 9 months. That's it." Repeating that mantra was the only thing that kept him from jumping to his feet, ripping off his plastic name badge and walking out, slamming the door. His hand trembled only once when he picked up the pen. Somewhere deep inside, something screamed that in this exact moment, he was fully handing his body over to someone else's rules. But that scream was drowned out by another voice, quieter and more stubborn. If he refused now, no one would come to save him or the baby. No charity fund would cover his debts. No social program would magically grant him a safe birth. His signature lay on the paper in a neat straight line. The lawyer added his own. Aiden and Marcus signed their boxes. The clinic sealed the documents. At that moment, Noah's life officially split into before and after. Before was the tiny room above the cafe, sleepless nights, fear of each new week. After was 9 months of a strictly prescribed regime in exchange for a sum that could finally pull him out of the hole. That evening, he went home along the same route, but the city around him felt different. Billboard families with huge smiles suddenly looked like mockery. The crush of the metro pressed harder than usual. Foreign smells blended into a thick, muddy haze. Noah sat by the window, clutching the handrail, and felt nausea rise to his throat, not from pregnancy, but from the awareness of the deal he had just made. Back in his room, he sat on the edge of the bed, placed his hand on his stomach, and just breathed for a few minutes. Inside, everything was still quiet. No kicks, no clear sense of someone being there. That helped him keep his distance. It was easier to treat the contract as a physical service, while his body still felt fully his own, not shared with someone else. But deep down, a thin crack had already formed. A crack between the role of temporary incubator the contract assigned him and the reality of a person who lay down every night thinking that something was growing under his heart. None of the people involved in the deal, not flawless Miss Pack, not perfect Aiden and Marcus, could have guessed how dangerous that tiny crack would become when, one day, a baby was born, who would decide for himself who deserved to hear his first word, Papa. The pregnancy followed the strict timetable they had given him. On Monday, he had blood tests. On Wednesday, a nutritionist. Every couple of weeks, an ultrasound. His phone beeped with dry reminders before each visit, and every beep scraped across his nerves. It meant not only control and safety, but also one more step deeper into a world that was not his. The clinic lived by its own rules. The lobby smelled of polished wood, fresh linen, and expensive perfume. There was never a line at the front desk. Only soft light, quiet voices, and the sound of wheels on a wheelchair being pushed down the hallway. There was a separate entrance, elevator, and waiting area for regular Omegas. Noah had seen that flow only once, on his first day. Gray plastic chairs, exhausted faces, children crying from fear. Then they explained that his contract gave him a different route. His elevator was quiet, lined with soft panels. No ads, just a little screen with the clinic logo and soft, wordless music. Every time he stepped into it, he felt the world split in two. Down below stayed his real life. The leaking window, the noisy cafe kitchen. Up here began a sterile reality where his name was in the database as part of an expensive project. The doctors treated him flawlessly and professionally. The midwife asked how he felt, tilting her head slightly, but her voice stayed calm and formal. The doctor, a man with a neat beard, spoke about his pregnancy the way one talks about numbers in a report. Blood pressure normal, hormones stable, fetus developing on schedule. There was something calming in this, and at the same time it was frightening. His pregnancy was becoming a set of parameters he had to match. Aiden and Marcus rarely missed any appointment where something important was decided. They appeared almost in unison, like in a glossy photo. Expensive suits, watches, good cologne. Aiden tended to stand slightly in front, as if shielding his partner from unnecessary attention by force of habit. His questions were short and precise. He asked about risk percentages, emergency protocols, at what point he could safely plan a vacation without fear of missing a critical stage. There was no warmth in his voice, but there was responsibility, clear and organized, like a blueprint for a new hotel. Marcus, on the other hand, was usually quiet. During ultrasounds, he sat closest to the screen, eyes fixed on the gray, flickering outline. When the doctor turned on the sound of the heartbeat, those tiny, rapid beats filled the room, and in that moment, something in Marcus's face always shifted. The mask of the focused professional cracked, replaced by a soft, almost lost expression. His fingers laced together as if he was afraid that if he moved, the sound might vanish. Noah lay on the examination couch, gel on his skin, listening to the same heartbeat and feeling everything inside him curl up. Formally, it was not his DNA, not his project, not his plans. But the heart was beating inside his body, beneath his ribs, reacting to his breathing. Every time the doctor asked him to relax so the sensor could get a clearer signal, the baby calmed faster than after any reassuring words from the alphas. With each passing month, the gap between his two lives grew sharper. By day, he stood in the hot kitchen in his grease-stained uniform, listening to the cook bark orders and customers complain about slow service. In the evenings, he climbed up to his tiny room, where the smell of coffee mixed with the dampness of old walls, and counted his crumpled bills on the edge of the table. At night, he tossed and turned, trying to find a position where his back didn't ache and the smells didn't make him nauseous. On clinic days, he put on his only almost presentable shirt, took the metro, and let himself forget the cost of the ride for a little while. The clinic elevator lifted him into a world of shining floors and staff in white, speaking quietly and smiling only with the corners of their mouths. Up here, everything was already paid for. The agency wired the money to the clinic on schedule, and Noah felt less like a person and more like a funded project. At these visits, Aiden sometimes looked like he was in 10 different places at once. Messages lit up his phone, and in the short pauses between questions to the doctor, he replied to someone whose life he was also managing. In those moments, an invisible glass wall seemed to drop around him. His attention went back to numbers, deals, meetings. He was physically in the room, but not really present. Marcus, in contrast, gradually started lingering after appointments. Not for long conversations. The contract restricted any informal contact, but for a few extra minutes in the hallway. He would ask how Noah was getting home, whether he was handling shifts okay, if the diet the nutritionist prescribed was enough. The words were neutral, but something human slipped through them, cracking the official tone. Those were the moments when Noah felt most clearly who he really was. A temporary shadow. A man who existed physically only during the transition between the perfect before and the even more perfect after, when the child would appear in photos framed between two alphas. His face and his name would not be there, and yet in those early ultrasounds, when the baby had just begun to move, it was his name that stood in the patient field. At home in his cramped room, he tried to keep his distance. He forced himself to repeat, "This is not your life. This is their child. You are just carrying." But the hormones did their work. At night, when the cafe downstairs finally went quiet and only the deep hum of refrigerators remained, he lay staring into the darkness and listened to himself. Sometimes he felt not just his own heartbeat, but another rhythm, faster, springier. In those moments he began to talk. Not out loud, the sound of his own voice in that small space would have driven him crazy, but silently, short phrases in his mind. He described the smell of freshly baked bread when the cook decided to bake some in the cafe. How, on rainy days, the roof above his room leaked in the same corner and he had to put down a bowl. How people in the morning metro pushed so hard that it hurt to protect his stomach from accidental bumps. Those were silly, useless details, but they filled the emptiness. The contract turned him into a function. These internal monologues reminded him that he had not completely dissolved in other people's schedules and payments. On one of the later ultrasounds, with the term already reaching the middle, something happened that stuck in his memory. The doctor was moving the sensor across his stomach as usual, quietly commenting on what he saw. Aiden sat opposite with a slightly tired expression. Marcus was right by the screen. Then a door slammed loudly somewhere in the corridor. Noah flinched. The sharp sound hit his raw nerves. At that exact second, the rhythm on the monitor jumped. The lines on the graph jerked. The doctor paused and asked him to take a deep breath and exhale. Noah obeyed, focusing on his breathing. The heartbeat on the screen gradually evened out. The doctor noted it out loud, almost casually. The fetus was very sensitive to the carrier's emotional state. The bond is strong. Marcus turned his head, and for the first time that whole visit looked not past Noah, but straight at him. There was something new in that gaze. Not pity, not clinical curiosity, but recognition. A simple, undeniable fact. There was already a connection between this body and the child that could not be squeezed into the phrase, "service provided." Aiden tensed, not because he heard the word bond, but because, in his rigid, organized mind, this phrase translated into risk. It meant any emotional breakdown in the surrogate could affect the baby. It meant a dependency the contract never mentioned. It meant that in a plan they had drawn as clean and simple, a human factor was appearing. Later, in the consultation room, the doctor recommended reducing stress, cutting his shifts, maybe taking him off work completely near the end. The agency agreed to pay extra to free Noah from most of his duties, selling it as care for the future child. On paper, it looked perfect. Better conditions, more funding, lower medical risk. For Noah, it meant something else. More time alone with his body and the life growing inside it. Fewer distractions to let him lose himself in orders and complaints. More hours sitting in his room, feeling the world split even further into two layers. In one layer lived Aiden and Marcus, the couple glossy magazines called Ideal. They shared projects, photo shoots, and a home where every detail was designed for comfort. For the outside world, they were an image, two successful alphas taking the next logical step and having a child. In the other layer lived him, an omega whose body had become part of their plan for 9 months. Outwardly, he was the surrogate carrier, with clear instructions and appointment times. Inside, he was a man who lay awake every night, hearing how his breathing soothed someone who, according to the contract, he was obliged to give away. Between those two layers lay a thin strip of clinic corridor where their worlds touched. There they greeted each other, exchanged a few formal phrases, looked at the same screen. There, Noah felt most sharply how temporary he was, like a shadow that only appears under a certain light and disappears when the owners of the photo move on to the next scene. He tried not to think about what would happen when the baby was born. The contract gave a clear answer. The newborn is taken. The surrogate gets his money. Everyone goes their separate ways. Clean. Neat. No drama, but every time the baby quieted at his voice, every time the graphs on the monitor smoothed out just because he calmed his own breathing, that clear scenario blurred. The question of who would be the real parent was still theoretical. But deep down, in the place he tried never to look, a quiet, stubborn refusal was already forming, the refusal to be only a temporary shadow. By the last trimester, the pregnancy stopped being just a line item in the contract. At one appointment, the doctor spoke in the same calm, firm tone, but his words were heavier. Term, load, age, hormone levels. In the recommendations field, a new line appeared about increased monitoring and preferably a controlled environment. Aiden listened, nodded once, and on the parking lot called the agency with his decision. Noah was simply informed. He was moving. They brought the new agreement that same day. A thick folder, a separate section about housing, a line about a personal nurse, a few more pages about confidentiality and non-interference in clients' private life. Noah sat at the agency desk, holding the pen with slightly shaking fingers, reading phrases he could now recognize at a glance. They were turning him into a line in a contract again, place of residence, allowed contacts, duties, prohibitions. The promise that he would not interfere in the couple's personal space sounded especially loud, as if he had ever had the right to interfere in it at all. The villa was not just a house. It was a carefully designed backdrop for a life where even a random shot from a security camera would look like an advertisement. A barrier gate, a smooth driveway, a long, low house trailing along the edge of the garden. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked onto greenery and water, the glass so clear it seemed like there was no boundary between air and interior at all. Inside, soft stone, wood, glass, light falling evenly without harsh shadows. Nothing extra. Every object in its place, not a single thing that seemed accidental. The guest house stood at the edge of the property, almost against the living hedge. From there you could see the main house, but the distance was carefully calculated so you could talk about respecting boundaries. A separate path of smooth stone led up to it, lit at night by soft lights set into the ground. No nameplate, not even a number. From the outside, it was just another tidy glass and wood box. Inside, the guest house was a scaled-down replica of the villa. The same clean style, the same climate control, the same smell of expensive cleaning agents and fresh linen. A large bed, a chair by the window, a tiny kitchen where everything was too new to look used. On the bedside table sat a monitor device. A bracelet on Noah's wrist tracked his blood pressure, pulse, contractions. Any sharp change automatically sent a signal to the main house in the clinic. He hardly slept at all the first night. He lay on the perfectly flat mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Not natural silence, but engineered silence. There were no doors slamming behind thin walls, no neighbors screaming at each other, no televisions blaring, no smell of frying oil drifting in from a kitchen below. Here, silence was part of the design, controlled, managed. At night, muted voices sometimes carried over from the main house. At first, there was only a low murmur, then it became clear who was speaking. Aiden's voice was low, steady, with that familiar hard note of control. Marcus's voice was softer, and sometimes a thread of exhaustion or faint irritation slipped into it. Noah could not make out the words, but he could read the mood from the intonation. On the outside, that couple was still the perfect model. The walls, as always, heard more. The villa staff were impeccably polite. The security guards nodded when they met him. The cooks left separate containers for him in the fridge, labeled according to the nutritionist's instructions. The housekeeper changed the sheets on schedule. The nurse came twice a day, checked his vitals, and made notes on her tablet. They all smiled and asked how he was feeling, but every "How are you today?" had the practiced tone of people used to serving high-end clients. Between them and Noah lay a transparent but solid layer. He was at once an object of care and an object of control. Aiden showed up rarely, but each of his visits ran like a protocol. He came with his tablet, clarified reports with the nurse, asked the doctor a couple of questions over video call, and sometimes glanced toward Noah with a brief, "If you need anything, let the agency know." His eyes slid over Noah's body, not like over a person, but like over a system he had paid for and was responsible for. Once, noticing how Noah's hands shook, he threw over his shoulder almost mechanically, "You're safe here." The phrase sounded flat, without warmth, like a line in the manual, not reassurance. Marcus began coming by more and more often. At first he stopped in under the pretext of bringing fruit, then he started bringing printed visuals of the nursery he was designing. He talked about light walls, warm wooden floors where the crib would stand, and where the chair for rocking the baby at night should go. He described a soft nightlight, drawings on the walls, curtains that would block out the morning sun. In his voice, Noah heard more than a desire to impress society with a perfect picture. There was a real, very personal dream about a home where one more living person would appear. Noah listened and felt something quiet and stubborn clench inside him. All these details were about the child, yet somehow passed right through him as if he did not exist. In the future room Marcus described, there was no space for the person who, for 9 months, had been the baby's only link to the world. Sometimes Noah wanted to snap, just once. "Did you ever picture that chair empty if the baby calms down only with me?" Instead, he nodded, listened, asked neutral questions about colors and materials, and pushed his own thoughts deeper down. The child behaved like a living argument no one knew how to hear yet. When Noah covered his belly with his palms, his breathing evened out and the kicks became softer, more rhythmic. When he showered and warm water ran down his skin, the baby settled, as if responding to the change in temperature and mood. When someone new walked into the guest house, a cook with a tray, an electrician checking sensors, there was a wary flutter inside. The tiny heart sped up the same way it did when the nurse's cold fingers pressed a sensor to his skin. Other people noticed these nuances too. At one point, the nurse let it slip that the fetus was clearly very attached to the carrier and that it was good from a psychosomatic point of view. Marcus went quiet for a fraction of a second longer than usual and lifted his eyes from his tablet to look at Noah's face. In that look, there was a strange mixture of respect, anxiety, and that jealous edge that appears in someone who has already tried on the role of primary parent. When Aiden heard the nurse's comment, he only drew the lines tighter around the situation. He repeated that it was important not to confuse emotional attachment with legal and biological facts, and firmly asked the agency to go over the contract conditions with Noah one more time. It was his usual way of extinguishing anything that fell outside the plan. Remind everyone about the paperwork, the sums, the deadlines, but paper could not cancel out what was happening at night in the guest house. The closer the estimated due date came, the more the nights broke into fragments. Noah would fall asleep and wake up from the pulling pain low in his belly, from his skin becoming too sensitive, from his own breath suddenly going ragged. At those moments he sat on the edge of the bed, braced his hands on the mattress, and stared into the darkness, where the silhouettes of trees loomed beyond the glass. Sometimes he heard doors slamming in the main house, footsteps on tile, a car door thudding shut farther away. In rare flashes of light from the big windows, he saw Aiden's and Marcus's shadows, one straight-backed, compact, the other a little hunched, hands in pockets. They moved through their home with the ease of people who truly owned everything down to the last object. He remained in between. The guest house had been assigned to him. It did not belong to him. The kitchen was his, but in reality was always ready for the next surrogate. The sheets under him could be changed at any moment, and no one would notice the difference. Even his smell did not linger there. The ventilation system refreshed the air too quickly, erasing any trace of his presence. Sometimes, especially closer to dawn, when the pain subsided and only a dull fatigue remained, a brief, almost childlike thought flashed through his mind. "This is not my home." It flared and then drowned in the list of things to do the next day: the appointment, the tests, the visit from the clinic doctor, the report to the agency. The night before, labor was especially hard. The sky pulled a heavy blanket of clouds over the garden. Wind broke branches. The rustle of leaves grew into a low, continuous roar. The pressure in the air pressed against his temples as if the air itself had become thicker. Noah tossed and turned, unable to find a position where his back did not ache and his muscles did not cramp. Inside, his belly was restless. The baby pushed and rolled as if he too could not find a place. He got up, pulled on a soft robe, and paced the room, leaning on the wall. He reached the window and placed his palm against the glass. Outside, the garden looked unreal. Perfect paths, soft lighting, not a single weed. All of this already belonged to the baby's life, the life where Noah's name was not on any list. The guest house walls seemed to close in that night, not physically, but in his mind. The space felt tighter, the air heavier. Thoughts he had always pushed away came rushing in. How would he walk out of here in a few days with an empty belly? Where would he go? Back to that same room above the cafe with the leak along the ceiling seam? Would the money be enough to rent something better? And most of all, how would he go on knowing that the baby would stay in a house that already knew his smell and his voice, not the voices of his official parents? At some point, a contraction hit so sharply that he had to brace both hands on the windowsill, gasping for air. The sensors on the bracelet came to life and started flashing. Somewhere in the main house, an alarm went off. His stomach clenched hard, but along with the pain came a strange, dense calm. Somewhere very deep, under the thick layer of fear, he already knew. No matter what was written in the contracts, no matter how perfect this house looked, inside the tiny body that was about to take its first breath, the first things that would be imprinted were his voice, his smell, his hands. In those seconds, he understood more clearly than ever what "a house that isn't his" really meant. The villa with its perfect garden, the guest house with smooth walls, the nursery Marcus had designed so carefully, all of that belonged to another life. The baby's real home had already been forming for months in the place where Noah put his hand on his stomach every day and whispered into the dark his useless little stories. And it was exactly this, invisible, not foreseen by any contract, that was already preparing to become the reason for a war that no one in the main house even suspected yet. Labor did not start the way it was drawn in clinic schedules and agency reports. In the middle of the night, when the garden around the villa was lit only by dim path lights and the house looked lifeless, the bracelet on Noah's wrist gave a faint vibration, warning of a rise in tone. He glanced at the small screen on the bedside table and tried to breathe evenly, writing it off as practice contractions. He'd had those before. Pulling pain, a few minutes of tension, then it let go. This time it did not let go. Something inside his belly tightened and grew heavy, as if the baby had suddenly decided to move off its spot. The pain rolled in, not sharp, but thick, stretching. Noah bent over, bracing his hand on the edge of the bed, and only then realized his breathing had gone ragged. The sensor on the bracelet flashed a red alarm. After that, everything happened fast, through other people's hands. The nurse burst into the guest house almost immediately, hair pulled into a tight ponytail, coat thrown over home clothes. She quickly checked his vitals, said something into her radio about labor activity and transport, helped Noah pull on loose clothes. His mind refused to accept that this was it. In the contract, in talks with the doctors, in the papers, labor had been a neat line in a schedule. Here that line suddenly became a heavy reality, yanking him out of the life he had just gotten used to. The car was waiting at the side entrance. Dim light, the smell of wet asphalt, a brief punch of cold air between the door and the inside of the ambulance. They laid Noah on a stretcher, fastened the straps. Monitors started humming around him. The vehicle shot forward, smoothly but fast. Every kilometer passed through another layer of pain, rolling over him in waves, leaving narrow strips of breath in between. He tried to count his breaths like they taught him. Inhale to 4, exhale to 6. Under his hand, a small, unseen by the world yet person tensed and moved. Along with the pain, the same thought kept breaking through. This was the beginning of a countdown, not just of contractions, but of the time left before they were separated. When this was over, they would take him either back to the guest house or to his old room above the cafe, and the baby would stay here, in the world of sterile corridors and expensive suits. The elite clinic seemed fully prepared, as if they'd been waiting for this night. He was met by light that cut his eyes after the darkness of the car and the strong smell of antiseptic. Other hands took over the stretcher, firm, professional. The questions came short and to the point. Frequency of contractions, water breaking or not, how the carrier felt. This time, Noah barely had to answer. The machines and the nurse with the tablet spoke for him. The operating block met him with a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. This cold was controlled, set to a number. White walls, the even glare of lamps, metal reflections on shining surfaces. They moved him to another table and hooked him up to more monitors. The anesthesiologist leaned over, introduced himself. The name immediately drowned in the roar of sensations, checked for allergies, explained the dosage. Everyone around him moved with well-rehearsed synchronization. Someone checked the IV, someone watched the monitors. The obstetrician listed the stages in a steady voice. It looked like a perfectly staged routine where everyone knew their lines and cues, except the one person whose body lay on the table. Marcus made it in time. He stood behind the glass in a sterile suit and cap, his face hidden under a mask. His eyes, though, were completely open and far too alive. They held fear, disbelief, and something close to awe. This was not the confident alpha who discussed budgets for charity projects. This was a man who saw his life about to split into before and after. Aiden was only a voice on the phone. Short messages kept coming to the doctor and the coordinator. Status of negotiations, estimated time of arrival, demand to be informed immediately about the baby's condition. His physical absence felt like a literal empty space where, in the perfect version of this story, the second father was supposed to be standing. The labor was hard. The pain smeared time into long bands, dulled only partially by medication. At one point there was too much noise, monitor alarms, commands, muffled phrases. Then everything suddenly narrowed down to one single sensation, intense pressure, and then release. The baby's cry cut through the air like a raw, clean note in the middle of a dull, booming symphony. It wasn't like in the movies, not a beautiful edited sound, but rough, hoarse, a desperate attempt to claw into the world any way possible. There was protest in it, and fear, and a demand. They lifted the newborn up, checked him under the bright light, measured his length and weight, tested his reflexes. Voices turned a bit softer. "Everything's good by the scale," someone stated, but the words reached Noah through thick cotton air. All he saw was a blurry silhouette of a tiny, wet body that, for the moment, didn't belong to anyone on paper and belonged to him physically 100%. By protocol, they put the baby on his chest. Warm, shaking bundle, damp skin, a pulse under his fingers beating fast like a bird's wings. At first, the baby kept crying, riding out the inertia of pain and light. Then, suddenly, he let out a long breath and went silent. The small body relaxed, his breathing slowed and deepened. The movements became rare and confident. The monitor watching his vitals showed a neat, stable pattern. There was quiet satisfaction in the doctor's voice. A routine, that's how it should be in the midwife's movements. For them, it was a standard effect of skin-to-skin contact. For Noah, it was the moment when all those past 9 months suddenly took on weight and shape. He lay there, barely feeling his own body under the drugs, and stared at the blurred features of the tiny face. The baby's eyes were still closed, the lids heavy, the lashes wet. To Noah it felt like he recognized in that small, almost invisible pattern of breath the same inner movement he'd listened to in the dark of the guest house. As if the two of them had finally met properly, not through skin and tissue, but face to face. The first break in the carefully scripted plan came when the protocol required the next step. After a few minutes, when the baby's vitals stayed stable, the staff decided to hand him to Marcus. It was logical. The father should hold his newborn, establish first contact, get that perfect inner snapshot that later becomes a family story. They gently lifted the baby off Noah's chest. The warmth left his skin, replaced by a strange emptiness. The moment that small body left him, the crying returned almost immediately. Not as loud as right after birth, but sharp and piercing. The baby's breathing lost its rhythm. The line on the monitor started bouncing. Marcus held his son carefully, like a fragile artifact. His hands trembled, not from incompetence, but from massive responsibility. He whispered something softly, but the baby did not respond. His body was rigid, tiny fists clenched tight. The cry turned more demanding. A machine beeped a warning. The nurse exchanged a quick look with the doctor. "Give him back," the obstetrician said in a dry, businesslike tone. They laid the baby on Noah's chest again. The cry broke off almost instantly, as if someone had turned a switch. His breathing evened out. The small head turned slightly, his nose burrowed into the skin. The monitor calmly went back to a smooth, steady line, green numbers sliding back into normal. Under the lamps among the metal and white coats, it looked like just another medical fact. The comments remained calm. Strong bond with the carrier, easier on the nervous system, nothing unusual, just adaptation. Noah heard those words as if through thick glass. For him, it was a blow. Joy, bitterness, confusion, everything clumped together in his throat. They tried repeating the scene later in the post-op room. When the anesthesia wore off a bit and Noah could raise himself slightly and feel his body again, they approached him with the same task. Marcus, more composed now after talking to the pediatrician, tried to hold the baby again. This time, they prepared more carefully, slowly, gently, avoiding any sudden movement. The result was the same. As soon as the distance between Noah's chest and that tiny body grew more than a few centimeters, the baby shifted into panic. His face pinched up, his mouth opened, his breathing went ragged, and the cry tore through the room. The moment they placed him back, everything settled, like a light turning off. Even the tension smoothed out of his features. He looked like a miniature adult who had finally found a comfortable position. Marcus tried to stay rational. He agreed with the doctors that it was temporary, that it happens, that for a couple of days the baby orients to the smell and heartbeat of the body he lived in. He nodded, asked all the right questions, clarified how long this phase usually lasts, whether they could build their own bond in parallel. But in his eyes, every time the baby refused to calm down in his arms, there was a shadow, a flicker of fear. The perfect story he had built in his head had cracked. No amount of money, genetics, or status could force this tiny person to accept a new figure in place of the one he already knew. By the time Aiden finally arrived, the morning was already in full swing. He walked into the ward, not like a shaken father from a family diary, but like a man who had been finishing a tough negotiation an hour earlier. His steps were confident, his suit immaculate, his expression collected. A tablet in one hand, emails flashing across the screen. No one greeted him with pure joy at first. He was met instead with a concise medical report. The coordinator and the doctor laid out the situation without emotion. The newborn was healthy, his readings were fine, but he showed a clearly pronounced dependence on contact with the carrier. In other arms, his stress levels spiked, which was not desirable in the first hours of life. They recommended a gradual, gentle separation, no sudden attempts to force a new bond, to avoid overloading his nervous system. To someone used to managing variables, this sounded like a problem, not a touching detail. Aiden listened, asking precise questions. His mind immediately went along lines of control and solutions. How quickly could they reduce this dependence? What protocols existed? How could they minimize the risk that the surrogate would start thinking the child is hers? When and where would Noah be moved? There was no open aggression toward the Omega in his voice, but each word carried a hard, wary edge. Noah saw him from the room through a half-open door when they brought Aiden to see his son. The alpha's gaze froze on the baby, and for a second, the business mask cracked. Awe, fear, a quiet burst of joy flickered in his eyes. Then, his gaze slid to Noah, and changed. It turned, assessing. Both alphas saw the same picture, a baby who panicked in other people's arms and calmed instantly on the surrogate's chest. For Marcus, it was a raw, frightening, but still human truth. For Aiden, it was a malfunction in the system that needed to be fixed. The doctors kept repeating that it all fell within normal limits. The baby had spent almost a year inside Noah. His body, voice, and heartbeat were his only reference points. Of course, he clung to that in the first hours. Over time, they said, he would switch to the smell and voices of the people who were always around him. Noah listened to those explanations and understood that something else was happening between the lines, the one thing no section of the contract accounted for. A living organism had made its own choice without asking permission from lawyers or the agency. The first tear in the careful scenario had appeared not in the paperwork, but in the cry of a newborn who recognized only one body as home. Lying in the post-op room, bone-deep exhaustion in his limbs and raw pain still pulsing underneath, Noah felt the rules change. They kept reminding him that he would have to leave as soon as the monitoring period ended. They talked about compensation, recovery, the new life he would have afterwards. But the small weight on his chest that kept choosing him over and over was quietly, insistently rewriting the ending. Somewhere in that same corridor, 3 separate lines of an invisible war had already begun forming. The medical line, trying to keep the baby stable. The legal line, defending the contract. And the human line, where heart, skin, and scent contested what had been signed in ink. In the first 24 hours after surgery, Noah hardly knew whether it was day or night. The room always had a dim light on, the machines clicked steadily, IVs dripped their clear seconds. He fell into heavy sleep and woke to his own shaky breathing and the same picture every time. A tiny bundle on his chest, a thin sensor band on a small leg, a green line on the monitor smoothing out whenever he pressed his hand a little closer. The routine took shape quickly and mercilessly. Nurses brought the baby to him on schedule and off it. Officially, for feeding, contact, maintaining stability. Unofficially, whenever that particular cry started in the nursery, piercing, desperate, like the world had gone wrong again. They already knew that bringing him into this room and putting him next to that familiar heartbeat would make the noise die down. Noah saw their looks change. At first they were purely work-focused, carrier, stabilization, protocol. Then there was respect, cautious and professional. Finally came that strange mix of pity and understanding he feared most. As if each of them was thinking the same unspoken thought. This has to end, but how is he going to survive it? On paper, his condition was satisfactory. The stitches healed, his labs were normal, his hormones swung but stayed within ranges that didn't scare anyone. For Noah, it all looked different. His body ached, throbbed, went queasy from drug changes, but the real pain came every time they took the baby away. Even for those required minutes, they tried little by little to shift the baby into Marcus's arms. They did everything right. Marcus sat in a chair. They placed the baby carefully on his chest, helped support his head, quietly coached him on how to breathe calmly. And each time, within seconds, the tiny chest began to heave too fast, fingers curled into tight fists, his face flushed, and the cry hammered off the walls like they were all back in the operating room. Marcus held on. He listened to the doctor explain that it just takes time, nodded, tried not to show how each one of those seconds burned him from the inside. Sometimes, when they returned the baby to Noah and he fell into a warm, heavy sleep in under a minute, Marcus lingered by the bed. He stood there, listening to the baby's breathing change, and caught himself thinking a phrase he was afraid to formulate clearly. Right now, this Omega was giving their son something he himself could not yet provide. Aiden never allowed himself that kind of softness. His presence always felt like a change in pressure. He never came alone, always with a coordinator, a lawyer, sometimes an agency representative. He checked reports, asked how many hours a day the baby spent with the surrogate, demanded forecasts. Every time he heard some version of, "We're keeping the current regime for now or the stress risk is too high," His jaw tightened. In his world, temporary measures existed to be phased out quickly. Here, they were doing the opposite. They were solidifying. Those 2 or 3 days were turning into until we see a stable trend. And that trend refused to appear without Noah. He sensed control slipping through his fingers. The staff looked less and less at him, less at the printouts proving genetic paternity, and more at the man lying in a hospital gown, pale and exhausted, with a baby on his chest. This person, who by contract was supposed to disappear from their lives, had become the functional center of the system. And the longer it stayed that way, the sharper Aiden's prickly irritation grew. Noah lived in a feverish gap between duty and reality. He knew every line of his contract. They had reminded him more than once that legally, the baby was not his. That he was a carrier, a service, a body rented for a while. That after discharge he would get money and freedom. Yet every time the baby pressed closer to his chest, each time a tiny hand clutched his shirt and a cold little nose pushed into his skin, those words meant nothing. He did not feel any triumphant, "This is my child." What came instead was something else, a heavy sense that he was stealing time, that every minute the baby slept on him was a minute Marcus could have spent with him, or even Aiden if he ever let his guard down. Guilt and tenderness tangled until it made him nauseous. Sometimes at night, when the shift changed and the hallway was briefly quieter, he caught his reflection in the glass. Pale face, deep shadows under his eyes, the child curled up on his chest. Compared to that picture, the memory of his tiny room above the cafe felt like another life. There, he had truly been alone in every sense. Here, he was not. And that scared him even more. The agency stayed involved. The coordinator came to the clinic more often than standard procedures required. She listened to the doctors attentively, nodded, clarified wording, took notes on her tablet. With Noah, she spoke gently, but every phrase sounded conditional. This is temporary. This is solely for the child's well-being. This does not affect the legal side of the contract. Even as she repeated those lines, her eyes for a moment turned more human. In that flash, there was the question no one here was allowed to ask out loud: what happens when temporary ends? The doctors looked for a way out too. No matter how elite the clinic was, it was still a hospital, with its own risks, infections, and night hallway noises. Even under filters and sterile discipline, the baby lived in a space where every loud sound shook his nervous system. One morning on rounds, the head physician finally put into words what they had all been circling around. It would be better for the baby if his adaptation to new caregivers happened at home. Somewhere without constant machine hum and antiseptic smell. Somewhere they could set light, sound, and daily rhythm for him, not for the ward schedule. On one condition, she added, the person he's currently so strongly attached to also has to be there for the transition period. The phrase hung in the air like a diagnosis. Aiden reacted sharply. The idea of bringing the surrogate, a living reminder of his loss of control, into his house felt like a violation of every boundary. He immediately began hunting for alternatives: extra newborn psychologist sessions, short visits from Noah on a tight schedule, any setup that kept the Omega attached to the clinic, not attached to the family. Marcus stayed quiet longer. He stood by the room window, watching a nurse adjust the blanket over the baby, asleep on Noah's chest, his fingers tapping lightly against the sill. In those soft taps, the conflict between logic and that fine, raw fear for another life was plainly audible. When he finally spoke, his voice was calmer than he felt. He agreed with the doctors home was safer, not just for the baby, but for them as well. The decision did not cancel formal boundaries, but it gave them a chance to get through this painful phase without constant screaming and breakdowns in the child's nervous system. They did not make the decision in one day. There were phone calls with the agency, meetings with lawyers, long documents sent back and forth with redlined edits. They needed a format that allowed Noah into their space without breaking the letter of the contract. On paper, it turned out neat. An addendum to the surrogacy contract, a clause about temporary childcare services as a live-in nanny. Clear timelines, duties, areas of responsibility, a separate room for Noah, a ban on him being part of the child's public life. A phrase stating that any emotional attachment created no legal grounds to change anyone's status. On paper, it really did look like a compromise, a live-in nanny to ease adaptation, a surrogate staying a bit longer to transfer his scent and rhythm to the baby. The alphas kept control and the right to say enough at any time. In reality, all Noah saw when they brought him that new packet to sign was his own last name printed under the heading Additional Services. He slowly read the lines about living in Aiden and Marcus's home, about being available around the clock, about his new duties, not just carrying, but soothing, feeding, putting the baby to sleep. For a second, it felt like he was back at square one. Before, his body had been a temporary home for someone else's child. Now his physical presence was supposed to become that home again, only on the outside. The same 9 months had stretched into an unknown length of time, dressed up as an adaptation period. He signed. None of the clauses gave him any illusions. But deep down, under the raw ache of stitches and hormonal swings, he held on to one simple thought. The baby cried when they took him away. He calmed when Noah was there. Everything else, for now, could be endured. The day of discharge was strangely quiet. In the morning, the room filled with packing sounds, rustling bags, nurses' voices, the dull rattle of stretcher wheels. They brought Noah clothes a bit more normal than the hospital gown and helped him stand up carefully. His body still felt foreign and heavy, but it held. They placed the baby into a car seat, buckled the straps, tucked a blanket around him. All three of them came to the door. Aiden, in a perfectly cut jacket, with the same controlling gaze half the clinic already recognized. Marcus, tired but softer than in those first days. Noah, still pale, with a thin line of stitches pulling under his clothes and hands that instinctively reached for the handle of the car seat. Just for a couple of weeks, the voices around them repeated, until he gets used to it, until he stabilizes. Those words sounded like a spell they were all trying to use on themselves. Ahead lay the villa, the guest house, the extra room. A new routine in which the contract nanny would pick up the baby every time he choked on his own crying, and the official parents would slowly learn to be what the documents already called them. The temporary measure left the clinic with them and climbed into the car. None of the three adults riding down in the elevator truly believed anymore that it would be over quickly. Coming back to the house on the hill with a newborn in their arms didn't just change their schedule, it shifted the entire axis of that space. The villa, where the main sounds had once been the quiet voices of two alphas, the clink of glasses at evening receptions, and the steady hum of air conditioning, now lived to one small person's rhythm. At different ends of the house, at different times of day, there were bursts of crying, hoarse babbling, short frightened squeals when that tiny body collided with hunger, colic, or simple fear of the unknown. The center of gravity of the entire villa moved toward the nursery and into Noah's room, now right next to it. They gave him the same guest bedroom beside the nursery that used to host private chefs or personal trainers for short stays. Now there was a simple bed, a rocking chair, a small table with bottles and a monitor linked to the sensor on the baby's leg. The door between the rooms almost always stayed slightly open, the nursery filled with Noah's presence, and his room with the soft, constant sounds of infant life. By day, the house still tried to pretend it was the same. The living room curtains opened as perfectly as ever. The staff set the table in the dining room. A trainer walked along the pool path, waiting for Aiden. But now all those habits followed one condition. Don't make extra noise near the nursery. Even the echo of footsteps in the hallways was softened with rugs that had never been there before. Inside this new routine, Noah stopped being just a guest. He became part of the infrastructure, the person who got up at night at the first monitor beep, the one who first took the baby in his arms when he choked on his own tears, while Marcus was still dragging himself out of sleep, the one who could tell just from the tone of the cry what was wrong. Wet diaper, hunger, gas, or simple panic. Aiden tried to hold the situation together the way he always did, through structure. His tablet now had a new app tracking sleep and feedings, synced with the clinic. He adjusted his meetings so he could spend a set amount of time in the nursery every morning and evening. For the first few weeks, it almost looked textbook. An alpha in well-fitted home clothes walked into the room, washed his hands, took his son from Noah, and did his best to follow the pediatrician's checklist. But the air in the room changed as soon as he touched the baby. The baby sensed that with brutal accuracy. The moment Aiden's strong hands wrapped around him, his breathing turned uneven, his small shoulders stiffened, and his lower lip started to tremble. Sometimes it took just a couple of minutes for a cry to cut through the quiet nursery like an alarm. Noah could feel on his own skin how the alpha's tension, his tightly contained anger at himself and at the situation, rolled down through that physical contact. He'll get used to it, Aiden told himself more than anyone else, and treated each new failure like a personal defeat. Marcus chose another path. He didn't grab for the lead role, didn't build charts, didn't demand quick fixes from the doctor. At first, he just sat nearby while Noah rocked the baby, watching the tiny face change, how clenched fists slowly relaxed, how breathing deepened and slowed. Then he began asking to move closer, to hold the bottle while Noah supported the baby's head, to rest a hand on the baby's back while he slept on Noah's chest. He was learning how to be present, not dominant. For an alpha raised to be the one in charge, that was new. The inner script he'd grown up with said that a family was a structure where the alpha had to be the support, the center, the authority. Here, the center had clearly chosen someone else. All Marcus could do was carefully build himself into the existing circle of safety, not break it. Noah lived inside that triangle as someone both necessary and out of place. His body was still recovering. The scar ached so much sometimes that every extra movement echoed with dull pain. His hormones behaved unpredictably. He could calmly change the baby in the morning and blink back tears in the evening when tiny fingers clutched at his t-shirt in panic. He kept repeating one phrase to himself: "This is temporary." He was a nanny by contract. The baby was not his. The couple was not his. But every morning when the baby opened his eyes and even without seeing clearly still turned his head toward Noah's voice, that mantra fell apart. At night feedings, when Noah, exhausted and half asleep, mumbled a blurred, "Easy baby, I'm here," and the child instantly relaxed and stopped jerking, all the words about temporary sounded like a bad joke. Evenings in the house turned into their own separate reality. Sometimes all three adults ended up in the nursery at once. Aiden with his tablet at the foot of the crib, Marcus in the chair by the window, Noah on the rug holding the baby. In those moments, the difference in their energy was almost tangible. Aiden would fire off questions, double-check formula doses, ask if it wasn't time to reduce Noah's involvement so the child would start bonding with his parents. His voice always carried the stubborn desire to force everything back into the contract. Marcus listened, but focused much more on the baby himself, how he reacted to being moved, how long he could stare at the nightlight, what sounds he made in his sleep. Noah did not join in their conversations, but reality still flowed through him. The baby was either sleeping on his chest or responding to his breathing. Sometimes the tension broke on small things. Once the baby suddenly started making hoarse little cooing noises, right when Aiden uttered the word adaptation in too official a tone. All three adults fell silent. Then Marcus snorted softly. For a second, all of them laughed. Only the tiny person in the center of the room stayed serious and focused, as if he was still solving the same survival problem. The lighter moments did not change the fact that the invisible conflict was getting sharper. Aiden increasingly felt the staff's eyes on him. The nurse who checked the sensors would soften when she saw the baby asleep on Noah's chest. The housekeeper, dusting the shelf by the hallway, glanced furtively toward the nursery when a quiet humming drifted out, and that simple, unspoken phrase crept onto her face: "He clings to him like to a dad." Of course, no one said that aloud in front of Aiden, but he sensed it in the pauses and how conversations in the corridors cut off as soon as he appeared, and when his inner irritation collided with the cold fact that the baby was still better off with Noah, the pressure inside him rose even higher. The outside world, for now, saw only a perfectly edited picture. A few weeks after the move, they arranged the first official photo shoot. A team arrived at the house: stylist, photographer, PR manager. The nursery and part of the living room were turned into a set. Marcus and Aiden changed clothes, rehearsed a few poses that were supposed to broadcast confident, loving parenthood. Before the shoot, Noah held the baby for a long time so he wouldn't get tired too early. The moment they carefully shifted him into Marcus's arms and turned him toward the lights, a thin inner spring tightened. Flashes, unfamiliar voices, sharp smells of cosmetics, All of it crashed down on the tiny nervous system at once. For a couple of minutes, the baby endured, blinking frantically toward the bright source, and then he let out that very cry that always made Noah's shoulders clench. The photographer suggested just quickly finishing the series. The PR manager asked them to rock him a little and push through. Noah, standing behind the camera, could almost physically feel the air compressing around the baby. What followed was like a sped-up version of those birth room experiments. The child slipped into a full-blown scream, panic shone in his eyes, his breathing went ragged. At some point, Marcus could not take it anymore. "He needs Noah," he exhaled, and there was not a drop of alpha pride in that short phrase. The shoot had to be stopped. They pulled in Noah almost like emergency therapy, shoved the same baby into his arms, the child they had been trying so hard to photograph without him. Pressed against the familiar chest, the baby at first kept hiccuping with sobs, then slowly quieted down. His tiny hand rested directly on the logo printed on Noah's t-shirt, like a seal that could not be erased by Photoshop or legal wording. After that, they managed to get a few careful shots where the baby looked calm and the two alphas looked confident. In the final photo, which spread through private accounts of friends and partners, all three were looking in different directions, but the line of their smiles really did match. In reality, right after the shutter clicked, the baby was taken back to Noah so he could help him come down from the overload of impressions. Each such episode fixed an invisible truth they could no longer wave away. The world saw Aiden and Marcus as the fathers, but the baby's inner compass was set differently. At night, when the house finally grew quiet, that was felt especially sharply. In the dark, lit only by dim nightlights, Noah lay in his room and knew that if the baby whimpered in his sleep even a little louder, a soft but clear sound would roll down the hallway. Footsteps. Sometimes it was Marcus, his steps unsure and light, as if he were afraid to scare his own fear away. Sometimes it was Aiden's heavier, more abrupt walk, ready at any second to prove that he could handle it. Most often, Noah still had to get up. He would rise without looking at the time, go into the nursery, pick up the baby, and sit down in the chair. In those minutes, roles and contracts receded. Everything boiled down to one simple fact: a small, warm body, genetically someone else's but completely dependent on his breathing, calmed down only with him. And from that combination, someone else's but chosen, it was both frightening and unbearably right inside. The house was learning to live with a new reality. It no longer belonged to two alphas who had once built it as proof of their own stability. Now, three adults lived there, each with his own set of fears and expectations, and one center of the universe, unable to speak but perfectly able to show who his anchor was. Formally, the terms of the addendum still applied. On paper, this strange coexistence had a clear end date. But every day spent in the nursery, every morning when the child reached for Noah instead of the neatly packaged idea of an ideal couple, made that date less and less realistic. The more days passed, the clearer it became. No one could call this a short adaptation period anymore. The schedule doctors and lawyers had drawn at the beginning had quietly cracked and kept splitting along the seams. The baby was growing, changing clothing sizes, sleep cycles, opening his eyes a little longer than before, but one parameter stayed absolutely constant. If Noah was in the room, the world was bearable. If he wasn't, the universe turned into chaos. The pediatrician, who came every few days to the house on the hill, spoke gently and measuredly, but his words were heavy. He explained that the baby's nervous system was still extremely plastic. For him, the stability of the world was measured not in square meters of a villa and not in the brand of formula, but in the smell, warmth, and heartbeat of the person he was used to. A sharp break in that bond could lead to attachment problems, sleep and feeding issues, even trouble with how the child would later perceive his own body. "It doesn't matter who you consider his parent," he once said quietly. "What matters is who is his anchor." The anchor was Noah. For Aiden, it sounded like a formal diagnosis of threat. His brain, trained to operate with metrics and risks, automatically started drawing tables. In one column, the ideal picture: 2 alphas, a child, a house on a hill, charity projects. In the other, the actual one, an omega surrogate on whom their son's basic functions still depended. He saw that mismatch as a corporate crisis, not as a human reality. He started closing himself in his office more often, talking to lawyers in a low voice. Noah could not hear the words, but he understood from the tone. They were discussing ways to optimize the situation. New addenda, compensation, a move to another city, stricter confidentiality clauses. In one of those conversations, a short phrase came out that made Marcus's fingers tighten around his cup. He can't stay here forever. Marcus felt frozen between those two poles. He saw the same thing Aiden did. A stranger in their house, a stranger's body their son clung to as to the center of the universe, but he felt it all very differently. The facts that looked like a threat to his partner more and more seemed to him an invitation to rethink his old beliefs about who had the right to be called a parent at all. He watched Noah in those rare minutes when the Omega allowed himself to relax, even slightly. In the morning in the kitchen, half asleep, rocking the baby on his hip while mixing formula. During the day in the living room, sitting on the floor among perfectly curated interior pieces with the child on his lap, staring absent-mindedly out the windows. There was not a trace of performance in those gestures, only quiet, stubborn presence. Noah never asked for more. He didn't try to squeeze extra money out of them, didn't manipulate them with the baby's attachment, didn't threaten to leave and see how you manage without me. He just showed up every time he heard a cry. At some point, Marcus caught himself thinking the impossible. If you judge by actions, not last names, the most adult person in this house right now was Noah. The living room, which had recently been the territory of business meetings and design presentations, became the main stage of an invisible front line. This was where all three adults and one child most often crossed paths, a child who did not know contracts existed, but perfectly split space into safe and dangerous. When Noah walked in with the baby in his arms, the air responded almost physically. Marcus straightened, as if someone had just lifted an invisible weight off his shoulders. Aiden, on the contrary, tensed slightly, his chin sharpening, a metallic note of control appearing in his voice. Each tried in his own way to secure the role of main adult in the room. One evening, this dynamic showed itself especially clearly. It was a late hour when the living room shifted from formal space to a dim, almost home-like room. The curtains were drawn. Soft light from a floor lamp washed over the low table scattered with papers. Marcus flipped through some plans without really seeing them. Aiden, back from another meeting, stood by the bar pouring himself water instead of his usual drink. Even he understood that some habits had to change with a baby in the house. Noah appeared in the doorway, holding the baby carefully to his chest. The child was no longer a newborn, but still tiny, with a heavy head and wide, surprised eyes. His breathing was even, but his gaze snagged on lights and moving shadows. "Give him to me. He has to get used to me," Aiden said briefly, reaching out his hands. The phrase wasn't rude, but a hard frame snapped into the air. Noah froze for a second, as if checking his inner balance, then carefully handed the baby over. The child's fingers slipped over the fabric of Aiden's shirt, tried to catch hold of something, and, not finding his usual support, flinched. At first, it went more or less tolerably. Aiden, clearly following memorized instructions, supported the baby's back, gently rocked him, spoke in a low, calm voice. For a while, the baby just stared past him, as if listening not to the words but to an invisible set of parameters: smell, heartbeat, overall body tension. Then his lower lip trembled. At first, it was just a soft protest, a wet sound that might still be soothed with a gentle tone. But the tension in the adult's body was rising. Aiden, without meaning to, gripped a little tighter, rocked a little faster. That sharp, nervous note slipped into his breathing, the very one the baby had already learned to read as a danger signal. The cry broke out suddenly and loud. In the big living room where deals used to be discussed, it sounded almost unbearable. The baby arched away from the discomfort, his tiny fingers grabbing at the air, searching for the only familiar outline. His eyes filled with tears, his cheeks flushed hot. "He's just manipulating with habit," Aiden thought stubbornly, but the child's body refused to fit his internal diagrams. Marcus got out of his chair faster than he had time to think. He stepped closer on instinct, but didn't take his son into his own arms. His eyes found Noah automatically, the Omega standing slightly aside with his hands clenched into fists. "Take him," Marcus exhaled, and there was no defeat in that one word, only acknowledgement of the obvious. Noah came over, trying not to meet either Alpha's eyes. His hands moved with familiar, almost professional ease. One palm under the baby's back, fingers supporting the head, the cotton of his t-shirt instantly soaking up the hot tears. For a few more breaths the baby kept sobbing, then recognized the smell and the warmth, and fell quiet. His breathing evened out, his small body went limp with relief. The silence that followed was louder than the scream. For Aiden, this scene was another tick on the threat scale. He saw the way Marcus looked at Noah, not with infatuation, not with admiration, but with that complicated respect so easily confused with dependence. He saw how the staff, pretending not to interfere, unconsciously relaxed their shoulders when the baby stopped crying in the surrogate's arms. It looked as if, in his own house, the main "everything's okay" signal came not from him. The world of outer rules was still on his side. A signed contract lay in the safe: surrogate, services, compensation, waiver of rights. The lawyers were ready to activate the new agreements at any time. Public opinion by default saw as parents those whose names stood on documents and under charity event titles. Even the pediatrician, for all his warnings, officially listed the boy as the son of Aiden and Marcus. On Noah's side were things that could not be counted in clauses or sums. The smell of skin the baby recognized with his eyes closed, the heartbeat his own breathing synced to, the voice he heard before he ever saw light, the warmth of hands that carried no tight expectation and no need to prove fatherhood, just simple, exhausting presence. Marcus found himself more and more often standing right in that strip of land between the two worlds. In the living room, where front lines ran along invisible borders, he instinctively stepped away from the purely legal position. He could not accept the idea that, for the sake of preserving their image, they would have to destroy a living bond that had already formed. Every new moment when the baby reached for Noah, instead of for him or for Aiden, hurt and healed at the same time. It hurt the idea that fatherhood could be built by plan, and healed him of the illusion that love was measured by how many documents you signed. On such evenings, when the tension thickened the air, Noah felt like a man standing in a neutral strip between two armies. He wanted nothing more than to disappear, to dissolve into the wall, to become again some anonymous surrogate number so-and-so, not the figure around whom jaws clenched. But every time he tried to step back, the baby reacted first, searching for his face, reaching out his hands, starting to fuss if his voice suddenly vanished from the room. Once, while lying on his lap in that same living room where big deals used to be negotiated, the baby suddenly made a new sound. Not a full word yet, but no longer random babbling. Something like "pa" pushed out on a half-breath with that special focus children have when a figure appears in their world around whom their safety builds. Aiden heard it first, Marcus second, Noah last. He was too busy supporting the baby's head. For a second, time froze again. A question hung in the air that no one dared speak. To whom would that first "pa" really belong when it finally turned into a full word? The living room, with its expensive abstract art on the wall and shelves lined with architecture books and charity photo albums, had turned into a field divided by invisible front lines. On one side, the contract, reputation, social expectations, and fear of losing control. On the other, a living child who had chosen his safe place not by last name or status, but by whose arms had first kept his world from falling apart. Between them stood Noah, still officially listed in the paperwork as a temporary service. And with each passing day, it became more obvious. Trying to cut him out of this picture on schedule would not just be painful. It threatened to become an explosion that would tear apart not only the contract, but also the perfect couple that had spent decades building their image as an unshakable family. The crisis started almost casually. At first, the baby just became more sluggish. That day, he napped longer than usual on Noah's arms, didn't ask much for attention, didn't protest diaper changes. The pacifier kept slipping from his mouth, and instead of his usual annoyed squeaks, he only sighed softly. Noah rode it off to the weather, to a small dip after a restless night. But by evening the child's skin felt strangely hot and his breathing a bit faster than it should be. He put his palm to the baby's forehead and felt a heat that went beyond acceptable. Not a number on a thermometer, but a heavy fever that made his body seem both too light and too tense. Panic rose in his chest, pounding dully in his temples. He called the pediatrician before the alphas had time to. Marcus understood something was wrong from the way Noah was holding the baby, refusing to put him down in the crib or on the changing table, even when his arms began to shake with strain. The pediatrician arrived quickly, with a case that always held everything needed for a house call. He took the baby's temperature, listened to his lungs, asked questions, and with each answer, his face grew more serious. A mild viral infection, he said. Not a verdict for most infants, but on the background of those first stress-filled months, the body might react strongly. The fever was rising, his breathing was getting heavier, changes were already visible in his blood work. He said a word that made all three adults freeze inside: hospitalization. The ambulance pulled up late in the evening. Night was only just tightening over the hilltops when a quiet but insistent siren cut through the house's usual sounds. The paramedics entered the nursery with the precise movements of people used to working at the edge of others' fear. They asked questions, attached sensors, and in that moment it became very clear who the child's real center of gravity was. When they had to quickly but gently shift the baby onto the portable stretcher, he clung desperately to Noah's t-shirt. His little hands trembled but held on, as if that fabric were the only solid shore he knew. They managed to calm the first hysterical wave only by allowing Noah to ride in the ambulance with the baby, holding him in his arms. There was only one seat left for another adult, and Marcus took it without thinking, leaving Aiden to follow in a separate car. Inside the ambulance it smelled of medicine, plastic, and fatigue. The baby, strapped in together with Noah, was a hot little bundle pressed into his chest, as if trying to dissolve in the familiar warmth. Each sway of the vehicle made his body flinch. When the paramedics asked Noah to lift the baby just a little so they could slide another sensor under him, he started to whimper. His breathing went ragged. As soon as Noah pulled him back to the old position, the rhythm calmed for at least a couple of breaths. The critical care room's light was harsh even for adults. White walls, gleam of metal, the rustle of gloves, the even beeping of monitors tracking every breath and heartbeat. They laid the baby in a transparent crib, connected him to the equipment. Plastic tubes and wires turned the little body into the center of a complex scheme the doctors read as a map of their war with the virus. But the neutral digits on the screens didn't show the main thing: how sharply the baby's condition changed the moment Noah stepped outside, even for a few minutes. At first, the doctors tried to follow protocol. They asked Noah to go into the hallway while they did procedures, to let him rest, drink some water. When the door shut, only professionals and the alphas remained inside. Marcus moved closer, spoke quietly, gently touched the tiny hand. Aiden stood a bit farther away, locked into his perfect suit like a man used to commanding but suddenly useless without his usual tools. The child's reaction was merciless. As soon as Noah disappeared from sight, for 1 minute, maybe 2, the baby tried to hold on to the remnants of calm. Then his lips began to tremble. His breathing sped up, his chest heaved in jerks. The crying rose quickly, as if the air had suddenly become too thick. The oxygen monitor showed a drop, the blood pressure numbers shifted, and the staff's voices carried that tension they usually knew how to hide. "Bring him back," the on-call doctor snapped once, not to the baby, but to Noah standing in the hallway with his throat tight from helplessness. The pattern repeated over and over. Noah returned to the room, walked to the crib, and even before he touched it, he felt that hot, shaking gaze reach for him. Tiny fingers wrapped around his hand. The cry broke, turning into sobs. Once they finally laid the baby on Noah's chest, his breathing stabilized faster than from any drug. The monitor, which had just shown alarming readings, began to calm down. Even those who trusted only labs and data couldn't ignore that. The doctors exchanged heavy, understanding looks. The nurses stopped asking Noah to leave unless it was absolutely necessary. At some point, the on-call doctor said aloud what everyone already knew. In the child's current state, the emotional factor mattered as much as the medication. Marcus watched all this from a chair by the window. The night outside was black, cut off from the room by layers of glass and plastic. He saw Noah, swaying from exhaustion, still holding the baby without letting himself collapse, saw how he lifted him up when the nurses needed access, and then pulled him back as soon as the procedure was done. Noah's hands shook, His eyes were bloodshot, but he asked for no break, no replacement, never once said, "I'm just here by contract. You don't even pay me for this." In Marcus's mind, the last support of the old logic slowly crumbled, the one that said you could sign a contract, pay money, and receive a guaranteed result. What stood in front of him now was an act that would never fit any clause. And Omega, officially assigned the role of temporary carrier, was staying on his feet purely on stubborn will, not to let go of the one clinging to him with small, burning hands. Aiden lived that night differently. He paced between the room and the hallway, between the coffee machine and a meeting room. He turned into an emergency office. His phone didn't stop buzzing. He talked to assistants, lawyers, managers, issued orders, checked reports, fully aware that nothing he said out there could change what was happening beyond the wall. The world he had built on control had cracked. The child he had planned for years as the logical extension of a successful union, in his critical moment, reached not for him, not for the last name, not for the wealth, not for the man who had paid for the best equipment in this clinic, but for the Omega who was supposed to disappear right after discharge. Each time he came back to the room and saw the same picture: Noah in a wide hospital chair, the baby asleep on his chest, and Marcus sitting next to them, leaning forward as if his whole life were inside that narrow triangle. A hard, almost stone line appeared in Aiden's gaze. The scene repelled him and drew him in at the same time, like a perfectly correct solution that clashed with his own principles. The night stretched thick and slow. The clock on the wall counted off the time until morning rounds, but none of the adults looked at it. Their whole universe shrank to the glow of the monitor and the weak breaths of that small body. Sometimes a nurse offered Noah a bed, promising to watch the baby. He only shook his head and held the child tighter, as if afraid he would vanish if he glanced away. At some point, Marcus got up, walked over, and awkwardly laid a hand on Noah's shoulder, supporting not the child but the one holding him. The gesture was clumsy, broken, but there was more genuine gratitude in it than in all the polished thank you speeches he'd given at public events. "You're holding all of us together," he thought, but didn't say it out loud. Morning stepped into the room together with the head doctor, a man whose long experience with the richest and most powerful alphas hadn't erased his ability to speak plainly. He studied the charts, asked the staff how the night had gone, and finally looked not at the baby but at the three adults. His tone was careful, but not coated in the usual client-pleasing politeness. He defined what was already clear from the night: they could not break the child's current attachment right now. They needed to widen his circle of important adults gently, gradually increasing the presence of his genetic parents, but not tearing away the only anchor he knew. He used a word that made Noah's breath catch: vital. Not recommended, not preferable, but vital. And he added that any abrupt move toward cutting off contact with Noah would go not just against his personal opinion, but against existing medical protocols. In the language Aiden understood best, that meant one thing: a risk you could not ignore, even for the sake of reputation. For Noah, that day became a line he couldn't step back across without damage. Until then, he had clung as best he could to the formula written in the contract. He was just a temporary body, a tool, a service. He told himself over and over that after a certain date, he was obligated to leave, no matter how he felt. Now his feelings were no longer just his private problem. He saw the baby, only just starting to recover from fever, reflexively squeezing his finger even in sleep. Saw the little head turning toward him whenever someone spoke in a strange voice. Heard the breathing go uneven when he stepped even a few steps away from the crib. And for the first time in many months, he let himself ask the question he'd always run from. What would happen if he left exactly as the contract demanded? Not to him, not to his life, but to the tiny person who had already chosen him as his safe place. The answer his imagination drew was too painful to say out loud. A child left without the familiar smell, without the heartbeat he knew, surrounded on both sides by adults in their own panic and pain. A nervous system that had just survived its first serious illness cracking under a double blow. Crying no one could stop with any method. For the first time in a long while, Noah felt that his own fear and exhaustion could no longer be his only reasons. He was no longer just a figure in a contract, but a person whose decision affected something far beyond money and status. And the longer he sat in that hospital chair, holding the baby slowly drifting off on his chest, the clearer he understood. Blindly following the contract and disappearing in silence would not be a neutral option. It would be a choice in favor of adults' comfort against the needs of someone who could still speak only by crying. The hospital room, where everything was measured in numbers, had become an arena where a truth none of them was ready for stood exposed. For Marcus, the truth that you cannot buy a guarantee of perfect fatherhood. For Aiden, that control cannot replace attachment. For Noah, that his own right to leave now collided with another person's right not to be abandoned. After the discharge, the house on the hill was no longer the same place they had once returned to, with glowing studio photos and an illusion of controllable future. The air in the rooms felt denser, as if the walls had soaked up the beeps of night monitors and the child's labored breaths. The baby came home changed, more sensitive, more wary of any shift. Any unfamiliar smell, stranger's voice, sudden sound showed up in his body as tension Noah learned to recognize before crying even began. The doctors, after discharge, spoke carefully, the way you speak to people used to believing they're stronger than any circumstances. They explained that the baby's nervous system was now as fragile as thin glass, and any sharp movement could leave cracks. Their main recommendation stayed the same, but now it sounded like an order. Do not break the primary attachment. Expand his circle of close adults gently, step by step, without ripping out the person he had chosen as his safe point. In medical terms, this meant only one thing. Noah's presence could no longer be treated as a temporary service. For Aiden, those words sounded like a verdict on his usual world order. In that world, you could build, lock down, and pay for everything. Here appeared a factor that did not obey schedules or contracts. He saw how the baby calmed in Noah's arms, how Marcus had grown more attentive to every move and word of the Omega, and he felt control slipping away despite all his efforts. In his mind, the third figure in their house was no longer support staff, but something far too important. And important, yet uncontrollable things always felt like a threat. He answered that threat in the only way he knew best, with money and contract. The lawyers gathered in his office, far from the nursery where the baby was falling asleep on Noah's chest, and behind closed doors they built a new structure. Draft agreements lay on the table, line after line spelling out the Omega's future. A large sum, big enough to close all debts, rent housing in another city, pay for education or open a small business, obligations to provide medical and psychological support so no one could accuse them of neglect. A confidentiality deal protecting the couple's reputation. Behind the ideal wording stood one main desire: remove the living man from their horizon, keep his shadow out of their future. The agency accepted the idea as a natural continuation of the cooperation. The manager, who had once shown Noah his first contract, now smiled gently over the phone, explaining that this was a rare opportunity. Her voice carried professional distance. To her, surrogates had always been clients whose cycle began with screening and ended with a signature on the final act. The new agreement looked like a generous bonus to someone who had already done more than enough. On those pages, cut through with straight black lines of printed text, a human bond was being turned into a resource to be carefully redistributed. When they called Noah into the office, the air smelled not like home, but like paper and filtered air conditioning. The glass tabletop reflected the neatly stacked folder. They laid out the offer in a calm tone, without pressure or threats. It was a chance, they told him, to start fresh, without returning to a life where every coin had to be counted. The money would let him choose a better neighborhood, study, step away from random cafe shifts. The agency guaranteed support, no traps, only clearly written mutual obligations. Noah listened and felt two parts of himself pull in opposite directions. One, the part that had lived on the edge of survival since his teens, responded instantly to the numbers on the first pages. Concrete images flickered in his head. Not a cramped room above a noisy cafe, but a small, truly his own apartment where the ceiling did not leak. Not hunting pharmacy discounts for the cheapest hormones, but regular checkups scheduled ahead. Not endless humiliation from customers, but the option to choose where and with whom to work. "Sign and run," that tired part whispered. The second part stayed silent longer, but its silence weighed more than any words. It remembered the hospital room where the child's burning body relaxed only when he pressed him close. Remembered nights in the guest house when tiny fingers clung to his t-shirt, even in sleep. He remembered how the baby, still barely able to see, already turned toward his voice as if somewhere inside he had forever recorded that exact tone as a signal of safety. That part of him did not know how to count money, but it knew the cost of ruptures very well. "If you disappear, no one will explain to him that it was for your future," it whispered. "For him, it will just be one more disappearance of someone he trusted." While Noah sat in front of the folder, not touching the pen, shifts were happening inside the couple as well. Marcus found out about the new agreement not immediately, but soon enough to feel the blow not only as a professional partner, but as a human being. When the lawyer carefully laid out the essence of the proposed solution, two incompatible images flared up in his mind. In one, he and Aiden, confident, composed, in perfectly tailored suits, were giving an official interview about their family, emphasizing how responsible and well-planned every step was. In the other, Noah in a hospital chair, exhausted, pale, holding their son not like some abstract line of inheritance, but like a small life he was responsible for with everything he had. Marcus's inner balance sheet, used to adding up pluses and minuses all his life, suddenly showed a different result. Yes, he wanted their family to look whole, with no third person in the frame. Yes, it scared him to admit that their ideal union had cracked where it was supposed to become a model. But the thought that, just to restore the picture, they were ready to remove from their child's life the person he had clearly chosen as his anchor started to feel like betrayal, not of Noah, but of the child himself. The atmosphere in the house changed quietly but noticeably. Breakfasts turned into silent rituals, clinking dishes, the even voice of the housekeeper, the smell of toast, and over all that, a thick, sticky tension between the two alphas. Aiden talked more and more about schedules and meetings, about how important it was to close this issue before the family ended up back in the focus of sharp-eyed cameras. Marcus fell silent more and more often, refusing to echo those arguments. He left the room when the conversation turned to sums and deadlines, as if he physically could not stay where the child and Noah were being discussed as budget lines. Noah felt that change in tone with his skin. He did not hear every conversation, did not see the documents, but the air spoke for itself. In the evenings, when the house grew quiet, he sat on the edge of his bed, opened the folder, and tried to read every line. The legal language, polite and impersonal, promised safety, support, protection from poverty. But between the lines, the main goal showed through clearly: to erase his presence from the formula, their family forever. Sometimes he caught himself nodding along with that inner survival voice. "They're offering you something you've never had. These people don't owe you anything more. You did your part. Now it's your turn to think about yourself." In those moments, he imagined leaving for another city, where the child in the house would remain only a picture in his memory. How in a few years he might tell himself it was long ago that he had chosen wisely. But as soon as the baby whimpered in the next room, even in his sleep, his body reacted faster than his thoughts. He got up, went in, picked him up, soothed him. And every time that small head found its place under his heart, all rational arguments crumbled. Solving this conflict alone was becoming unbearable. One evening, Marcus knocked on his door himself, without his usual certainty, without the mask of the perfect host. He came in, sat on the edge of the armchair where toys lay during the day, and for a while just looked at the folder on the table. Heavy but honest silence hung between them, two people who had pretended for too long that everything was under control. The conversation that followed was quiet, without big promises or beautiful phrases. Marcus spoke about how tired he was of the role of window-dressing alpha, who always has to know what is right. About how hard it was to admit, even to himself, that a contract signed with a cool head now ran against what he felt when he looked at his own child. About a fear that had nothing to do with reputation, not being afraid of losing status, but of one day hearing his teenage son accuse him of driving out of his life the person that boy had thought of as his real dad. Noah listened and did not know whose side he should take. He did not want to be the wedge between partners, did not want to destroy someone else's relationship. But every attempt to imagine his life without this child returned to the same feeling. He was not the only one responsible for the choice. The child had already made his own, the only one he was capable of now, reaching out to him instead of someone's perfect plans. By the end of the day, no decision had been made on paper, but inside it had stopped being pure arithmetic. The folder with the offer lay closed on the table like a suitcase that had never been opened before a trip. Aiden waited for a signature, believing the right amount would eventually outweigh the doubts. Marcus looked less and less at the numbers and more at the way the child clung to Noah. And Noah stood between money and conscience, knowing that any step forward would cut this bond forever. The house lived in the mode of a held breath, and it was clear. The exhale, when it came, would leave none of them the same. The realization that they had gone too far did not come in a single moment. It crept in slowly. The house operated in a state of stretched-out conflict. The same walls, the same view from the windows, the same smell of expensive coffee in the mornings. And at the same time, the sense that all three of them were step by step approaching a line beyond which they would no longer be able to pretend that nothing had happened. The child still reached for Noah. Marcus spent more and more time in the nursery. Aiden dove deeper into work and documents. Marcus was the first to say the word therapy out loud. For a man used to solving problems with plans, architecture, and control, it was almost an act of surrender, admitting that there were layers inside their family they could not handle. Aiden took the proposal as a jab. In his world, calling in an outsider meant admitting his methods had failed, but this time, even he saw that memos and financial models had no effect on whom the child silently reached for. Noah's reaction to the idea was even more complicated. The thought of having to talk in front of a stranger about his own childhood, about poverty, about a body that had too often been turned into a resource, made his throat clench. He had learned to compress his pain into a compact, invisible knot, not spread it out on the table. But when the therapist, specializing in attachment and non-standard families, said in their first phone call that she wanted them to think not about who would feel comfortable, but about what was safest for the child, that argument cut through his resistance. Dr. Hannah Lee's office was in a neutral part of the city, far from the villa, the clinic, and their usual routes. A small room on the top floor of an office building where, instead of glass partitions and logos, there were soft chairs, bookshelves, and a big, almost empty desk in the corner. The windows looked out over a park. Traffic noise stayed as a muted background. There were no framed charity photos, no diplomas hanging as trophies. A few certificates were quietly placed to the side like technical information, not decorations. They started the first session, just the three of them, without the child. That already felt odd. Used to clearly assigned roles, they could not immediately figure out where to sit. Aiden took the farthest armchair, back straight as if he were preparing for a business meeting. Marcus instinctively sat between him and Noah, like a shield against a possible blow. Noah sat closer to the door, on a simpler chair, feeling like a temporary guest, even in a room they had all entered with the same invitation. Dr. Lee did not rush. She listened more than she talked, asking short questions that felt uncomfortable precisely because they were simple. She asked each of them in turn to describe why they were there. Not with grand phrases, but in the way they would one day explain it to the child when he grew up, and asked why there had been 3 adults in his childhood. Aiden started in his usual way. He spoke about how important it was to preserve the family they had been building for years, about reputation, about responsibility to the business, employees, charity projects. His speech was polished, but too much like a speech. Dr. Lee gently stopped him and asked him not to explain the situation, but to say what he actually feels when the child turns away from him and reaches for Noah. That was when Aiden's voice cracked for the first time. Not numbers came out, but hurt and fear. That the man who had invested in the house, the plans, and the idea of fatherhood had become the one the child did not choose. Marcus turned out to be more ready for this format. He spoke more slowly, choosing his words carefully. He admitted that for a long time he saw the child as a project meant to strengthen the relationship, not as a person. That he had valued the perfect image, 2 alphas, 1 baby, the right house, and that somewhere along the way he had lost sight of the living man carrying that baby and the living child who was choosing whom to trust. His voice shook not with anger, but with shame. When it was Noah's turn, a special quiet settled in the room. They did not ask him to defend himself, just to tell how he had ended up in that chair. He spoke of a poor apartment where his hormone crashes were treated as a personal whim, of parents who saw their Omega Son status as a problem, not part of who he was, of how he'd learned to accept pain as the price of survival, bad jobs, humiliating relationships, a surrogacy contract, and how he had thought he could stay detached from the child he carried, until he felt that tiny heart settle only when he was near. His words were even, almost flat in tone, but Dr. Lee watched more than his voice. She watched how his fingers tightened on the armrest, how his shoulders rose at the word family, how his gaze slipped away whenever the talk turned to money. Her job was not to announce who was guilty, but to show where legal formulas were covering open wounds. A special part of the session was devoted to the baby. She asked them to describe specific scenes, who held him, how he reacted, how long it took to calm him. Not, he loves me or he rejects me, but details. What his eyes looked like, how his breathing changed, what his body did. For Noah, this was the easiest part to talk about. He was used to bodily signals. He described how the baby grew heavy in his arms when he trusted, how the tiny fingers relaxed when he fell asleep on his chest, how his breathing turned shallow when the emotional weather in the room changed. Marcus added his observations. He admitted that their son calmed in his arms only when Noah was nearby, within earshot, that without that third presence, his attempts to lull the boy often turned into a new round of screaming. When they spoke about Aiden, tension slipped into their descriptions. Aiden himself insisted the child was simply fussy and not used to him yet. But the details said something else. The baby picked up even the smallest changes in his voice and body, reacting as if he were always braced for an invisible blow. The stories showed not malice, but emotional distance shaped by a life where being vulnerable had always been dangerous. Dr. Lee gently drew their observations into a single picture. She did not say, "You are a bad father," or "You are a good one." She invited them to see that, for the child, support was the person next to whom his nervous system calmed down. Right now, that was Noah. That did not erase Marcus's role or cancel Aiden's efforts, but it did mean that the choice to remove this support just to restore a neat scheme would not just be breaking a contract. It would be tampering with the baby's basic safety system. In one of the sessions, they finally talked about the new folder of money. Aiden described it as a proper end to our cooperation, stressing that he was offering Noah more than originally promised. His voice carried conviction. Money is the clearest, most provable way to show recognition. Dr. Lee did not argue with that directly. She simply asked them to imagine how they would explain to the child, when he grew up, why the person he had felt safe with disappeared right after receiving a large sum. Silence fell over the room. None of them could come up with a version that sounded honest. Any story ran into awkward truths. It was convenient, it was easier, that's how it's done. For a moment they saw themselves from the outside, not as heroes of a sophisticated drama, but as adults ready to trade a child's primary attachment for their own comfort. For Noah, this part of the conversation was especially painful. He heard the words about compensation and opportunities, and each one sounded like the many ways people had once told him, "Your pain is worth this much." Dr. Lee gently pulled him back to the core question. Did he really want his body and feelings to be priced out and closed off by a payout one more time? And could he live with the fact that the cost this time would be not only his own life, but the inner world of a child? Therapy did not give simple answers. After each session, they left the office not enlightened, but tired, with headaches from the unfamiliar level of honesty. But slowly, something shifted in each of them. Aiden, without noticing it himself, started saying the word contract less often, and responsibility more. Marcus began to say aloud that an ideal couple is not a title, but a job that sometimes includes admitting your own mistakes. And Noah, for the first time in his life, heard a professional voice call him not surrogate and not problem omega, but an adult whose choices affect other lives. The scariest part for him was this: the clearer the therapist made it how important his role had become in the child's attachment system, the more obvious it was that any decision would hurt. Whether he left under a new contract or stayed in the house, he could no longer see himself as a temporary service. And if before he had comforted himself that a signed paper would mean the pain stayed only inside him, he now had to admit that in this story, his steps would echo in a small heart for years. Dr. Lee's office became the place where, for the first time, this truth was said out loud. And once spoken, it was impossible to go back to the old logic of money for a body, no matter how much part of their former life wanted to believe everything could still be solved with numbers and stamps. The first rumors appeared quietly, almost like a rustle in some distant corner of the net. A post in an anonymous Golden District blog, a hint in a podcast about unusual family setups, a scrap of a phrase in the comments under one of Marcus's photos. Noah saw almost none of it. His days were filled with the child, his nights with short half-sleeping rests. But he felt the change in how the house behaved. Aiden started spending more time on the phone behind a closed office door, stayed longer in the city for meetings. In his voice, drifting once into the hallway, there was that special metallic shade that meant not normal workload, but a threat that had to be put out. Marcus, on the contrary, slowed down. He sometimes sat for a long time in the nursery, holding a mug of cold tea, listening to the baby snuffle on Noah's chest, as if trying to memorize that sound for the future. The explosion came when a tabloid ran a piece with a photo of their villa's facade and a blurred shot of a female staff member carrying a baby. The text came with a familiar set of words: scandalous scheme, shaky morals, surrogate refusing to leave. The author hinted that in the home of a famous alpha couple, someone was supposedly replacing the real parents with an emotionally dependent omega. Other outlets picked up the story. News sites added their own touches: old photos of Aiden and Marcus at charity events, their interviews about family values, comments from experts on the risks of non-standard models. In the comment sections, camps quickly formed, those accusing the couple of exploiting an omega and those accusing Noah of ruining a family. Nobody knew the details, but that did not stop anyone. For Aiden, this was the nightmare he had guarded against for years. His career had been built on being in control. Deals, charity, the public image of a successful alpha who knows what he's doing. Now, all of it was dangling over the gap of a PR scandal. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. Partners demanded explanations. The PR team sent him a long document of recommendations with one key line: clear, decisive action. At the heart of that document was a simple thought. They had to return to the original contract and show that the surrogate had completed his role and no longer participated in the child's life. Publicly, explain it away as a personnel management error. Privately, have Noah sign a strict non-disclosure agreement, increase his compensation, make sure he disappeared. The colder logic of PR and corporate management did not allow for nuance. The villa grew cramped with what no one said. Noah did not read the articles, but he saw how faces changed around him. Security looked at him differently now, not with neutral politeness, but with cautious curiosity, like at a potential liability. One junior kitchen worker averted his eyes several times when Noah walked past with the child in his arms. Even the air felt thicker, saturated with the expectation of a decision that would soon come from above. The conversation between Aiden and Marcus happened in the evening after the baby had gone to sleep. Having rocked him, Noah lingered for a moment at the nursery door and caught only fragments. Low, tense voices, the words business, crisis, can't go on like this. He wanted to leave, but his feet did not move, as if the floor under him had turned to something viscous. He grasped the full meaning later when they called him into the office. A familiar thick folder lay on the table, this time even more carefully worded. The new agreement promised a sum that would make anyone who had lived in poverty lightheaded. It included extra guarantees, paid therapy, help with moving to another city or even country, legal protection from press harassment, and one key clause: complete withdrawal from the child's life and any contact with him in the future. From the outside, it was the perfect move. A responsible couple, faced with unexpected complications, takes care of the surrogate, but clearly separates roles. For analysts and onlookers, the picture would reassemble easily. Two alphas, one child, one one-time scandal successfully contained. In private, it looked different. Marcus sat across from him, his face a mix of fatigue and resolve. His hands were clenched as if he was holding on to something invisible, not to lose his balance. Aidan stood at the window, hiding behind the city view. His voice was hard, clipped, insisting this was best for everyone, that the child was small and would forget quickly, that Noah would get the chance to start fresh. The ultimatum was not aimed at Noah, but at his partner. Either Marcus agreed to the plan and helped implement it as smoothly as possible, or Aidan would leave. Not metaphorically, leave the family and their shared business structure, take his share of the assets, and leave Marcus exposed, emotionally and financially. It was the same pressure tactic he used in business, create conditions in which the opponent could not stomach the potential losses. In his old life, Marcus might have given in. He had been raised where saving the structure mattered more than admitting it had been built wrong. But months of living beside Noah and the child, nights in a hospital room, sessions with the therapist, had changed the geometry of his decisions. Now, looking at the folder offering to pay for silence, he no longer saw an elegant solution. He saw a polished form of violence. He knew that if he agreed now, he would spend the rest of his life explaining to himself and to the child, who would one day grow up and start asking questions, why the person he instinctively called Papa had simply vanished. And no amount of money could make that story an honest one. The split had been building for a long time, but the public scandal became the last crack running through the house. Marcus's choice was not a grand cinematic line of refusal. It grew out of a chain of small moments, the way the baby only fell asleep on Noah's chest, the way Aidan kept calling him the project instead of a person, the way Dr. Lee calmly put the word responsibility above the word contract. He chose not the path that was easier, but the one that would still let him look in the mirror. The break with Aidan was short and hard. They both understood there was no return to their old image of an ideal couple. Aidan chose to hold on to what he could still control, the business, his familiar configuration of power, distance from the chaos of raw feelings. He agreed to a split of the assets, to formalizing the separation, to another wave of press attention, as long as he did not have to live every day in a house where a contract had lost to a child. The legal work took weeks, but the direction was set. Lawyers assembled a new package of documents in which the former union was officially dissolved and assets divided by the formula common in wealthy alpha families. The main difference was this. In the section concerning the child, there was no longer a line saying the surrogate vanished from the equation. For the first time in the official papers, a word appeared that had never been there before. Caregiving adult. Not a parent by blood, not temporary staff, but a person whose right to be there was based not on genetics or money, but on the fact of long, stable presence and on professional recommendations. Noah got that status not because one of the alphas suddenly wanted to do him a favor, but because the doctor, therapist, and lawyer, each looking from a different angle, agreed on one thing. Removing him would break the child's foundation. The custody and legal rights were drawn carefully. The child remained formally under the shared responsibility of the two alphas, but priority of residence was set for the home where his primary attachment had actually formed. That was the house where Noah had lived from the baby's first days. Aidan accepted a visitation schedule and participation, but could no longer dictate who had the right to hold the boy at night. To the outside world, the decision looked strange. Lawyers used to classic schemes frowned. Some tabloids sneered that an Omega secured himself a place in an elite family. But inside this small universe, something else was happening. The lie supporting the old structure collapsed. For Noah, it all felt like a slow fall and, at the same time, like a window opening. He felt Aidan's departure not only as relief. With him went a part of the structure he had grown used to, an extra adult whose presence, for all its harshness, had been a big shield between the house and the world. Now that shield had cracked. They would have to learn to live without that constant second layer of protection. Instead of the familiar labels surrogate and nanny, he now had formal acknowledgement of what he had long been in reality, one of the people committed to being a support for the child. The paper only caught up with life, but paper alone did not make things easier. With his name in that caregiving adult field, the responsibility grew. He could no longer hide behind "I'm just temporary" or "I'm just earning money." Every sleepless night, every decision on how to respond to another bout of crying or a new wave of articles became part of a long story he now owned as much as Marcus did. The break with Aiden opened the door to a new kind of home they still had to build, from scratch, without the title of ideal couple, under the noise of a public scandal, but with one simple and frightening truth. This child had the right to all the adults who had actually held him when he felt bad. And for the first time in his life, Noah was among them, not by chance, but by named and recognized role. Months passed, then almost a year. The house on the hill slowly stopped being a set piece for an alpha power couple and turned into a living space that was hard to describe with ready-made words. This was where a child named Theo lived. For him, Papa did not mean a legal status, but a smell, warmth, and who showed up when he was scared. His Papa was the one whose heart he had heard before he was born, the one whose arms had always held him when the world was too loud. That person was Noah. Marcus, who stayed after the separation from Aiden, gradually found his role not through competition, but through addition. If Noah was Theo's base, his quiet harbor he could return to any time, Marcus became the one who brought in the outside world. He took his son into the city, walked with him in a small park with old trees, showed him building models, explained how lines on paper became streets. His role was not about pushing out another bond, but about choosing to be one more solid point. From the outside, their daily life looked almost ordinary. In the mornings, the house woke to the patter of bare feet, Theo sneaking from his room into Noah's bed, curling up with his back pressed to Noah's chest. A few minutes later, Marcus appeared in the doorway with clumsily made coffee, sat on the edge of the bed, and for a few moments, three people who had once been linked only by a contract lay there like a settled family. Then, the usual rush began. Breakfast, getting dressed, checking schedules, calls, to-do lists. The relationship between Noah and Marcus stayed undefined for a long time. At first they were joined only by shared responsibility. Together they stood over the crib when Theo's teeth were coming in, taking turns walking him around the house, checking his temperature, listening to his breathing. Together, they looked for specialists when a child therapist advised them to gently talk with Theo about his family story so there would be no blank spots. Together, they chose a kindergarten where no one asked too many questions about why the form listed several adults under father. Within those everyday tasks, they began to see each other not through the old roles surrogate and client, but as two people with their own wounds. Noah, with a life as an omega who had survived by selling his body and who had always feared being thrown out at any moment. Marcus, with the history of an alpha who had spent years under other people's expectations, treating relationships like projects. Their closeness grew not from sudden passion, but from countless quiet moments. One making tea for the other at 3 a.m. because the child could not sleep again, or simply sitting nearby while the other read a kindergarten report about how Theo was telling other kids that he had many dads. Aiden did not disappear completely. Under the new agreements, he came several times a year, announcing his visits in advance, and took Theo to the city for a few days. At first, these meetings hung on a tight wire of tension. Noah tensed up at the mere presence of the man who had tried so hard to erase him from the child's life. Marcus behaved evenly, but every move carried caution. Only Theo, still too young to read those inner springs, responded simply. He enjoyed the new impressions. Then, back on the hill, clung to Noah with obvious relief, as if checking that everything was still in place. Over time, the visits softened. Aiden did not become a different person, but life had apparently forced him to recognize some of his limits. He no longer spoke of the boy as a project. He listened more to Theo's stories about preschool, new friends, how Marcus showed him buildings in the city. And once, when the boy, coming back from a short walk, took Aiden's hand and pulled him into the nursery to show his drawings, something flickered across the alpha's face, something like a quiet, painful, honest fear. Fear of losing not control, but a bond that could no longer be bought. In the outside world, their family's configuration raised questions but not disasters. At the kindergarten, staff stiffened at first when they saw that 2 men and an omega turned up at parent meetings, and the child was equally comfortable with both. But time and consistency did their work. For the teachers, accepting reality was easier than fighting it. When other children asked why Theo had so many dads, the answers came out simple. Different adults had helped him come into the world and now took care of him together. Children's minds accepted that much more easily than adults. For Theo, Papa was not a single title but a way of being. Papa Noah was the one you could always curl up with and say nothing when everything felt too much. Papa Marcus was the one who showed him how bridges worked and why the city lights flicked on at night. Aiden was the man who brought books from the city, funny stories, and sometimes his own worn-out but genuine attempts to be closer. The boy's world was more complex than the standard picture, but it had one crucial advantage. None of the adults had the right to force him to choose a real parent. Noah changed almost as visibly as the child grew. The day he first walked into the surrogacy agency now felt like a scene from someone else's life. Back then, he had treated his body as a resource he could rent out in exchange for money and 1 more year of survival. Now, sitting on the nursery floor, feeling Theo grow heavy on his lap at the end of a long day, he understood that his body had become something else, an embrace no contract had the right to price. His omega sensitivity, once mocked by old acquaintances, was no longer a stigma. In this family, it became the main safety tool. He was the first to notice when the baby's breathing shifted with rising anxiety, when Marcus was exhausting himself to the point of transparency, when Aiden's visit added too much tension to the air. His ability to talk about it calmly, without accusation, became what kept the system from breaking apart again. In the evenings, when the house was still and only wind and a few distant lights below showed through the windows, Noah sometimes allowed himself a short glance back. He remembered the tiny room above the cafe, the cheap pills, the visit to the agency, the sterile office, the first look at Marcus and Aiden, the heavy contract with the clause that he must disappear after the birth. That whole line now looked like a rough sketch reality had crossed out and redrawn over. No paper contract could have predicted a night in a hospital room where the baby grabbed his shirt and stopped crying. No clause described the evening when Marcus came home from the city, quietly sat down on the floor next to him, and said just a couple of words about how grateful he was that the 2 of them had survived that year together. No lawyer had written in the sound of Theo's laughter when the boy, tangling his words, called all 3 adults with one word: mine. The house on the hill remained a strange unit that would not fit into any standard template. It was not a classic family unit, and it did not match simple labels. But precisely in that lack of definition lay its strength. There was no perfect formula here, only a sequence of actions: to show up when called, to pick up when small fingers tremble, to admit that any of them could make mistakes, and stay anyway. For BL's story of love, this story is not about a perfect fairy tale where everything falls into place without pain. It's about how, out of bad choices, harsh contracts, and other people's expectations, a family can still grow, a family that cannot be squeezed into the boxes of a form. If you have listened to it to the end, take a moment and think whose choice felt the strongest to you. Noah, who refused to sell his bond; Marcus, who went against the easy scenario; or even Aiden, who chose to leave rather than break the others. Write about it in the comments, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next forbidden BL story on BL Story of Love. And while you're waiting for the new one, protect your own right to the kind of family you choose for yourself, even if no contract in the world can describe it properly.